You know how everyone has their little bedtime routine? Brush teeth, fluff pillows, maybe whisper a kind word to the alarm clock so it behaves in the morning? Well, mine usually runs smooth, until one evening it jammed like an old record player and refused to move past the tea stage. I brewed a cup, then somehow another, and before I knew it, my kitchen looked less like a home and more like a suspicious underground tea festival. Neighbors wandered in. Daisy contributed questionable sniffing expertise, and Linda made her opinions very clear. Stay with me, friend. This is the story of how one innocent chamomile nearly unraveled bedtime itself. It all started the way bedtime usually does for me, with a quiet, dignified ceremony of convincing myself that, yes, it really is time to stop rummaging through the fridge for just one more snack. I know bedtime is supposed to be peaceful, almost poetic. Soft pajamas, a whisper of lavender in the air, maybe a candle flickering like it's auditioning for a romance novel cover. But in my house, bedtime looks more like an obstacle course. First, Daisy the dog insists on conducting an exhaustive perimeter check of the living room. By perimeter check, I mean she trots in circles, pausing only to sniff suspiciously at the couch cushion where a rogue cracker crumb might be hiding. Linda, my wife, sits at the dining table with her reading glasses low on her nose, muttering things like, "If you'd just fold the laundry before 10 p.m., we wouldn't be tripping over socks at midnight." And then, there's me, standing in the kitchen, staring at the electric kettle like it's a crystal ball. This is the tea stage, my nightly ritual. A simple, sensible cup of tea before bed. Just one. Except, of course, on this particular night. Now, let me confess. I take my bedtime tea seriously. I have a little collection of boxes in the pantry. Chamomile, peppermint, sleepy time blends with pictures of bears wearing nightcaps. If the apocalypse ever comes, I'll be ready with enough herbal tea to soothe an army. That night, I chose chamomile. It felt safe, trustworthy. A tea that whispers, "Everything is fine, and tomorrow you'll definitely remember where you left your car keys." I boiled the water, poured it over the bag, and watched the steam curl into the air. Peaceful, right? Cozy even, except I drank it. And then immediately thought, I could really go for another. Now, this isn't unusual in itself. Sometimes one cup just doesn't quite stick the landing. But for reasons I still can't explain, the second cup didn't close the curtain on bedtime either. Instead, it opened the door to what I can only describe as a full-blown neighborhood tea summit. Before we get to that chaos, let me pause and admit, I should have gone to bed right then. I should have brushed my teeth, folded the socks, and tucked myself under the covers like a sensible adult. But no, my brain whispered, "Why stop now?" And that whisper was louder than any sleepy time bear on a box could handle. So I brewed another. This is where Linda entered the scene with her trademark eyebrow raise, the one that says, "I married this man willingly, but I still reserve the right to be baffled." "Another cup?" she asked, peering over her glasses. "It's chamomile," I said defensively, as though chamomile is a loophole in the laws of physics. Practically bedtime juice. Linda shook her head and returned to her book, muttering something about herbal overdoses. Daisy wagged her tail like she was voting in favor of more tea, though, in fairness, Daisy will wag her tail at anything that isn't the vacuum cleaner. The second cup went down just as smooth as the first, and then a third one seemed logical. After all, what's 3 cups of chamomile? Just 3 little flowers swimming around saying, "Shh, go to sleep." Except somewhere between the third and fourth cup, I realized my bedtime routine was no longer on a straight path. It was looping like a record skipping. Tea, sip, smile. Tea, sip, smile. The clock ticked on. The kettle hissed like an impatient librarian, and I began to feel like bedtime wasn't approaching. It was circling me like a hawk. Now, here's the part where Daisy got involved. She sat at my feet, nose twitching, clearly convinced that the steam from my mug was some sort of invisible treat. She pawed at my leg until I crouched down and gave her the customary pep talk. "Daisy," I said, "you don't want tea. You're a dog. Dogs don't do tea. Stick to kibble. Stick to chasing squirrels and napping in sunbeams. Leave the tea madness to me." She sneezed in my face. Classic Daisy. Meanwhile, the kettle was starting to feel less like a household appliance and more like a co-conspirator. I swear, when it clicked off after boiling, I heard it chuckle. And just as I poured cup number 4, the doorbell rang. Now, normally a doorbell at bedtime is not something you want. It usually means someone's car alarm went off, or a neighbor needs jumper cables, or possibly both. But I shuffled to the door with my mug in hand. And who should be standing there but Gary, my Hawaiian shirt-wearing neighbor, holding a box of Earl Grey. "Thought I smelled tea," he said cheerfully. "And that, my friend, is how a quiet bedtime chamomile transformed into an event that would spill out into the neighborhood before the night was through." Gary, my Hawaiian shirt neighbor, has a sixth sense for snacks and beverages. If someone 3 blocks away opens a bag of chips, he somehow appears at the window like a parrot who learned how to use doorbells. So really, I shouldn't have been surprised when he showed up at 10:15 p.m. with that grin and a box of Earl Grey like he'd been summoned by the tea gods themselves. "Gary," I said, clutching my chamomile, "it's bedtime." He waved his hand dismissively. Bedtime is a social construct. Tea, however, is eternal. Linda, still at the table with her book, groaned audibly. "Oh no, don't encourage him." But it was too late. Gary marched into the kitchen like he lived there, plopped his box of tea on the counter, and began rummaging through my mugs as though we were running a cafe. Daisy barked, thrilled to see her favorite snack donor, because Gary always smells faintly of barbecue chips. "Is this a party?" he asked. "No," Linda said firmly. "Possibly," I admitted at the same time. Gary clapped his hands. "Tea party it is." Now, tea parties at 10 o'clock at night are not what the brochures for adulthood promise you. Those brochures talk about restful evenings, balanced routines, maybe 8 hours of undisturbed sleep. But no, there we were. 2 grown men, 1 skeptical wife, and a dog who thought any gathering was an opportunity for treats. Gary brewed his Earl Grey. I brewed chamomile number 5. At this point, I was no longer drinking tea for relaxation. I was drinking tea because it felt like I'd signed up for some strange endurance race. And then the doorbell rang again. Linda didn't even look up. "I'm not answering it." I opened the door, and there stood Carl, our mailman, off duty in sweatpants, holding a thermos. He grinned sheepishly. "Heard laughter. Figured there might be tea." Gary cheered. "The more, the merrier." And just like that, my bedtime routine had expanded into a 3-man tea symposium. Carl poured something out of his thermos that he called experimental oolong, which sounded like a science project, but tasted suspiciously like lawn clippings. "This," Linda muttered, snapping her book shut, "is why normal people lock their doors." "Linda," I said, "it's tea. Tea is civilization." "Civilization is overrated," she replied, marching off toward the bedroom. "Good luck explaining this when the neighbors complain." Of course, I didn't hear her completely, because Gary was already telling a long story about how his uncle once tried to make sun tea in December by putting a jar on the roof during a snowstorm. According to Gary, the result was iced tea in the most literal sense. Carl nodded gravely, as though this was sacred wisdom. Daisy barked approval. I sipped my chamomile, and it hit me. I wasn't just stuck on the tea stage. The tea stage had exploded, multiplied, and invited guests. My bedtime routine was now a group activity with no exit strategy. At some point, maybe cup 6 or 7, I noticed the clock. Midnight, the witching hour. Except in our house, the witching hour just means the dishwasher sounds creepier than usual. I thought about brushing my teeth and sneaking off to bed, but then Carl leaned forward with that conspiratorial mailman look. "You ever try mixing peppermint with chamomile?" Gary gasped. "You're talking fusion tea." And suddenly, I was back at the kettle, because apparently I cannot resist experimental beverages when presented with peer pressure and an electric whistle. By cup 8, I was buzzing. Not caffeinated buzzing, because chamomile doesn't do that, but a kind of herbal confidence. The kind where you think, sure, I could write a novel, build a shed, and knit matching sweaters for the entire block before sunrise. Daisy, meanwhile, had abandoned all pretense of normalcy and was now wearing Gary's Hawaiian shirt, which he had taken off in some bizarre gesture of tea solidarity. Don't ask me how she got her front paws through the sleeves. I just know that she strutted around the living room like she was headed to a luau for dogs. Carl took pictures. Gary raised his mug in a toast. To late-night tea, unlikely friendships, and dogs with questionable fashion sense. We clinked mugs. The sound was strangely satisfying, like the universe confirming that chaos had, indeed, taken the wheel. And then, because the universe wasn't done with me, the lights flickered. Now, flickering lights at midnight during a neighborhood tea gathering feels less like coincidence and more like foreshadowing. Gary gasped dramatically. Carl muttered something about electrical grids. Daisy barked at the ceiling. I thought, if the power goes out, we'll all be sitting in the dark, sipping tea by candlelight like some kind of herbal seance. The light steadied, thankfully, but I had the uneasy feeling that bedtime was now permanently out of reach. By the time we hit 1 in the morning, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a tea house that had lost its permit. The kitchen counter was buried under mugs, spoons, tea bags, and one alarming puddle of something Carl swore was oolong concentrate, but looked suspiciously like mop water. Linda reappeared in the doorway, arms folded, eyes narrowed. She'd changed into her pajamas, which meant she was officially in done with all of you mode. "Henry," she said slowly, "why are there 3 men, 12 mugs, and a dog in a Hawaiian shirt in my kitchen?" 14 mugs, Gary corrected, pointing proudly to the dishwasher where he'd been stashing extras like trophies. Linda sighed. "I'm going to bed. When I wake up, this had better look like a house and not a failed tea shop." She padded off again, Daisy prancing behind her like an assistant manager checking on operations. Gary and Carl looked at me. I looked at the kettle. The kettle looked at me. And, as though hypnotized, I filled it again. Now, let me pause here to say, if you ever want to test the limits of friendship, invite 2 grown men over at midnight and offer unlimited tea. The conversations will wander into places you didn't know existed. Carl began explaining the hidden politics of mailbox placement. According to him, if your neighbor's box leans slightly forward, it's a power move. Gary countered with a passionate theory about how the pineapple pattern on his Hawaiian shirt was a universal symbol of hospitality, which is why Daisy had chosen it as her evening gown. And me? I was just trying to remember if my toothbrush would taste like chamomile when I finally got around to using it. We were on cup 10 when the second knock came. Not the polite ding-dong of a doorbell, but an honest-to-goodness knock like someone trying to sell vacuum cleaners. I opened the door and found Marjorie, our elderly neighbor, standing there with curlers in her hair and a teapot in her hands. "I heard chatter," she said briskly, "and clinking. Don't think you can have a tea gathering without me." Before I could respond, she pushed past me and set her teapot on the counter like she was claiming territory. Gary beamed. "Marjorie, finally, someone who understands." Carl saluted her with his mug. And so, part 2 of the tea symposium began. The expansion era. Marjorie brewed something she called Sleepy Garden Mix, which smelled like a meadow had exploded inside my house. The steam filled the kitchen, and suddenly, everyone was swaying and humming like it was a folk festival. Even Daisy flopped onto her side, overwhelmed by the floral fumes. By 1:30, the kitchen was at capacity. Mugs clinked, stories flew, and I realized that bedtime wasn't just delayed. It had filed for permanent relocation. At 2 a.m., the conversation shifted again. Carl began explaining how he once accidentally delivered a pizza flyer into a wedding invitation envelope. Gary swore he could taste emotions in tea. Marjorie recited a poem she'd written in 1974 about dandelions. Meanwhile, my eyes felt both heavy and wide awake at the same time. A strange paradox. I wasn't tired, but I wasn't alert either. I was floating in a state I can only describe as herbally confused, and then, the final straw, someone, no one will admit who, suggested we make iced tea. At 2 a.m. So there we were, 4 adults and a dog rummaging through my freezer for ice cubes. Gary found 3. Carl suggested freezing more water. Marjorie muttered that young people had no patience. Daisy tried to climb into the freezer altogether. Linda emerged again, this time in full exasperation mode. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, arms crossed, radiating married disappointment. I raised my mug sheepishly. "Want some iced tea?" Her silence was deafening, and then she turned on her heel and went back to bed, Daisy trotting after her again like a tattletale who couldn't wait to report my crimes. By the time the iced tea was served, I realized something crucial. Bedtime wasn't stuck on the tea stage anymore. Bedtime had packed a suitcase, booked a flight, and left me behind entirely. But at least the iced tea was decent. By 3 a.m., my kitchen looked like a tea bazaar that had been hit by a mild tornado. Mugs everywhere, damp tea bags piled like strange botanical fossils, steam fogging the windows so thick you could have drawn stick figures in it. And somehow, despite the hour, the energy was building, not fading. Gary was pacing the living room, dramatically narrating the ancient history of Earl Grey as though he'd lived it personally. Carl had commandeered my toaster as a makeshift tea warmer. "Don't ask, it's postal science," he claimed. Marjorie was humming lullabies to her Sleepy Garden Mix, which was bubbling away like a witch's brew on my counter. And me, I was floating in the middle of it, sipping cup number 12, thinking, well, I'll either never sleep again, or I'll suddenly wake up next Thursday. Then it happened. The window cracked open. Not because anyone opened it, mind you, but because the steam was so heavy that a drip ran down the sill and onto the porch, and that apparently was enough to attract another neighbor. A shadow appeared outside, then a knock. I opened the door to find Jerry, our street's unofficial neighborhood watch captain, though nobody asked him to be. He was holding a flashlight and wearing a reflective vest like he was patrolling an airport runway. "Everything all right here?" Jerry asked, shining the beam directly into my chamomile-fogged eyes. Gary answered before I could. "Better than all right. We're conducting late-night tea diplomacy," Jerry sniffed. "Smells floral." Marjorie shoved a mug into his hand before he could object. "Drink." And that's how Jerry, the most no-nonsense man on the block, joined the tea spiral. Now, Jerry is the sort who treats everything like a security breach. So once he had a sip, he started pacing, reporting imaginary incidents. "Possible oversteeping at the counter," he barked. "Suspicious sugar spillage near the sink. Stand by for further updates." Carl and Gary saluted him. Marjorie rolled her eyes. I just kept drinking because at this point I was too far gone to stop. By 3:30, Jerry had set up tea perimeters. He taped a napkin to the fridge as an official sign, declaring the kitchen a hydration zone. Daisy naturally joined the patrol, barking at shadows and nearly tripping Jerry with her enthusiasm. That's when the noise must have finally spread, because the next knock wasn't at the door. No, it came from the backyard. We all froze. Even Gary paused mid-Earl Grey monologue. "Who's in the yard?" Jerry whispered, flashlight ready like he was about to arrest a raccoon. We crept to the sliding door, mugs in hand like nervous lanterns. Outside, under the dim glow of the porch light, stood a small group of neighborhood teens. They looked caught, guilty, like raccoons indeed. But instead of spray paint or trouble, they were holding bubble teacups. We heard, "This was the tea house," one mumbled. Gary clapped like he'd just seen fireworks. Yes, it is. Come in, join the symposium." And just like that, my kitchen gained 4 more bodies. They plopped down, slurping tapioca pearls loudly, and soon began lecturing us on tea culture trends. Apparently, chamomile is retro, peppermint is basic, and bubble tea is the future. Marjorie was offended. "I've been drinking peppermint since before your parents existed." Gary nodded solemnly. "Respect your elders, especially their tea choices." Carl whispered to me, "I don't understand what boba is." I whispered back, "Neither do I, but I think it's edible marbles." The teens rolled their eyes at us, which is their natural form of communication. By 4 a.m., my house had become something between a tea symposium, a youth club, and a command center for Jerry's hydration patrol. The kettle was working overtime. My counter groaned under the weight of mugs. The fridge hummed nervously as if it knew it was next on the list of exploited appliances. And me? I was in my pajamas, eyes wide, clutching cup number 14, muttering to myself, I just wanted chamomile. Just 1 cup. That was all. Meanwhile, Linda hadn't reappeared. I had the distinct feeling she was upstairs lying awake, not from the noise, but from pure married indignation. And she was probably right. Because downstairs, it wasn't bedtime anymore. It was tea town, population, everyone but Linda. By 4:30 in the morning, my living room had given up any claim of being a respectable family space. The coffee table was buried under an avalanche of mugs, spoons, half-empty sugar bowls, and a sticky honey jar that kept gluing everything together like culinary cement. The carpet smelled faintly of peppermint, chamomile, and was that oregano? No one admitted to the oregano. Daisy had plopped herself onto the couch, wedged between two teenagers with bubble tea, her tail wagging like a metronome set to chaotic jazz. She looked far too pleased with herself for a dog who was supposed to be asleep hours ago. At one point, someone had tied a napkin around her neck like a tea sommelier's scarf, and she wore it proudly. Carl had taken control of my recliner and was now giving a detailed lecture on the hidden artistry of mail routes. "You think it's just putting envelopes in boxes," he said, swirling his mug like a professor with brandy. "But no, there's rhythm, there's flow, there's the drama of a windy day." The teens stared blankly, sipping their boba. One whispered, "Is he serious?" Gary, meanwhile, was pacing the living room in his socks, arms raised like a preacher. He was still mid-lecture on the global legacy of Earl Grey, which had somehow reached Chapter 7, the revolutionary implications of citrus notes. And then, he boomed, waving a tea bag dramatically, "The bergamot changed everything." The teens gave him polite nods, the kind usually reserved for relatives who corner you at Thanksgiving. Marjorie had claimed an armchair and was locked in a fierce debate with a teenager named Kyle. "Peppermint," Marjorie declared, shaking her mug like a gavel, "is timeless, calming, elegant, a classic." Kyle shook his bubble tea. "Peppermint is basic. It's the pumpkin spice latte of herbs. Everyone pretends to like it, but nobody chooses it." Marjorie gasped so loudly I worried she'd need smelling salts. "Young man, I have chosen peppermint since before you were born." "Yeah," Kyle said, "and I bet you also chose black and white TV." The room oohed like it was a rap battle. I sat on the edge of the couch with mug number 15, wondering if chamomile could cause hallucinations. Because surely this wasn't real. Surely I hadn't hosted a suburban tea summit with representation from every generation and fashion sense. Then Daisy barked. Not her casual, "I see a squirrel" bark. No, this was the urgent bark, the one she used for actual suspicious activity, like the time the recycling bin blew over and she was convinced it was alive. We froze. Jerry, who'd been patrolling with his flashlight like a mall cop, whipped around. "Perimeter breach," he barked. He crouched low, scanning the window. Gary whispered, "Do you think it's raccoons?" Carl muttered. "If it's raccoons, I have an oolong that'll keep them calm." "Please," I said, pinching my nose, "do not drug the wildlife with oolong." We tiptoed to the sliding glass door, mugs clutched like nervous lanterns. Outside, under the dim glow of the porch light, was a shadowy figure. Jerry yanked the door open, flashlight blazing. And there stood Tom, the man from 2 streets over, notorious for mowing his lawn at odd hours. Midnight? Noon? Doesn't matter. If Tom feels grass should be shorter, he fires up that mower like it's his patriotic duty. He was holding a thermos and looking sheepish. "Smelled tea," he said simply. Of course he did. The entire block probably smelled like an overstuffed tea bag by now. Tom stepped in, set down his thermos, and poured out something dark. "Yerba mate," he announced proudly, as though unveiling a lost treasure. The teens gasped. "That's hardcore," one whispered reverently. Gary leaned over the mug, inhaled deeply, and nearly fell backward. "It smells powerful, like gym socks soaked in destiny." Marjorie sniffed it too, wrinkling her nose. "More like socks without the destiny." Tom grinned. "Keeps you awake for days." "Days?" I repeated, horrified. "I'm just trying to survive until sunrise." But it was too late. The yerba mate was circulating. The teens declared it edgy. Gary immediately tried to blend it with Earl Grey in what he called a fusion experiment. The result tasted like lemon furniture polish with a caffeine punch that could wake a walrus. Carl, ever loyal, drank it anyway. He said thoughtfully, eyes watering. Bold, confident, slightly terrifying. Marjorie gave it a tiny sip, pursed her lips, and muttered, "I've had worse at church socials." Jerry, never one to miss an opportunity, scribbled something on a napkin and taped it to the wall. In big block letters, it read, "Yerba Incident." By 5 a.m., the house wasn't just awake. It was buzzing. Literally buzzing because someone had turned on the blender to make tea smoothies. No one knew who. The teens claimed it. Gary claimed it. Even Daisy barked suspiciously like she wanted credit. And then the shouting started. From outside, a groggy voice from across the street bellowed, "What are you people doing?" Gary threw open the window, mug raised triumphantly. "Tea, friend! Tea for all!" I buried my face in my hands. But it was too late. The noise had drawn even more people. First came Pam from the corner house, shuffling in with curlers in her hair and a tray of scones she just happened to have lying around. Who just has scones at 5 a.m.? Then Larry arrived, wheeling his squeaky bicycle right into my hallway. Nobody asked why. Nobody dared. Finally, as if the tea gods wanted to mock me personally, the local barista appeared. Off-duty, in pajama pants, carrying her personal espresso machine like it was a newborn child. "I heard there was a caffeine crisis," she said gravely, plugging it into my already overburdened kitchen outlet. The crowd erupted in cheers. Even Jerry gave a solemn nod. And me? I just stood there, pajama-clad, hair sticking up like a frightened dandelion, clutching my mug. I tried one last desperate attempt to reclaim sanity. Standing in the middle of the chaos, I raised my chamomile high. "Friends, neighbors, teens who don't even live on this street, I just want you to know, this all began with one simple cup of chamomile." Silence fell. Dozens of eyes on me. Steam curled dramatically around my words. For one brief shining second, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd realize how absurd this all was. Then Gary shouted, "To Henry's chamomile!" The room exploded with cheers. Mugs clinked, scones flew like confetti. Daisy howled in solidarity, and the barista began pulling espresso shots like it was a championship event. It was official. My bedtime routine wasn't stuck anymore. It had mutated into something far worse, a full-blown neighborhood festival. And judging by the way the crowd was growing, this wasn't ending anytime soon. Because as the first pale light of dawn crept through my blinds, someone, I swear it was Kyle, the peppermint skeptical teen, shouted the words that sealed my fate. "Let's take this tea party outside." And the roar of approval that followed was so loud, Linda stomped on the floor upstairs in pure marital thunder. There's a special kind of horror that comes when you see daylight sneaking through the blinds and realize you haven't even attempted to sleep. It was 6 a.m. My eyes were wide open, my pajama shirt was spattered with tea stains, and my kitchen looked like a botanical crime scene. But it was too late to stop anything, because Kyle, the peppermint skeptical teenager, had shouted, "Let's take this outside!" And the mob of tea-fueled neighbors had agreed, as though he'd just suggested a treasure hunt. Within minutes, people were spilling out my front door carrying mugs, trays of scones, leftover bubble tea, and at least one confused Daisy still wearing her napkin scarf. "Outdoor expansion," Gary declared, as though we were pioneers settling new lands. He raised his mug like a flag. "The great lawn awaits." Now, my lawn is nothing to brag about. A little patchy, some dandelions, one sprinkler that hisses like an asthmatic dragon. But apparently, at dawn, after a night of tea consumption, it becomes the ideal site for a neighborhood festival. Jerry, ever the watchman, marched to the curb and began directing traffic. Except there was no traffic, just joggers blinking in confusion at the sight of 20 pajama-clad people milling about with steaming mugs. He pointed at one jogger and barked, "Hydration check." The poor man nearly fell into the bushes. Carl had dragged a folding table from my garage and declared it the tea command center. He lined it with mugs, labeled them with sticky notes, and began assigning blends like a postal worker delivering destiny. Marjorie sat in a lawn chair with a blanket over her knees, sipping her sleepy garden mix like a queen overseeing her empire. "This," she announced, "is how neighborhoods should operate." The teens set up a bubble tea station, using my garden hose for water and a suspicious number of plastic straws. Meanwhile, Daisy decided this was all clearly for her and sprinted up and down the block, barking at birds and occasionally stealing unattended biscuits. Every time she zoomed past me, the napkin around her neck flapped like a superhero cape. And then came Linda. The front door creaked, and there she stood, bathrobe, slippers, hair slightly askew, and the unmistakable expression of a woman whose patience had expired 4 cups of chamomile ago. She looked at me, then at the crowd, then at the scone crumbs on the lawn. "Henry," she said in that calm, terrifying tone, "why is there a tea convention on our front yard?" I gulped. "It's, community bonding?" "Community bonding?" she repeated, eyes narrowing. Gary jumped in. "It's true. This is history in the making. Someday people will say, 'Remember the dawn of the great tea gathering?'" Linda folded her arms. "No, someday people will say, 'Remember the morning Henry lost his mind?'" The crowd laughed nervously, except for Jerry, who saluted her like she was a general. Linda pinched the bridge of her nose, sighed, and muttered, "Fine. But if this ends with the police being called, you're explaining it." Spoiler, I almost had to, because by 7 o'clock, the tea party had drawn in half the block. People showed up in robes, in running gear, in work uniforms. One neighbor actually brought a folding grill and started frying eggs on the sidewalk. "Tea needs breakfast," he explained cheerfully. Another neighbor lugged out a karaoke machine. Suddenly, the sleepy morning was filled with someone belting Moon River off-key while sloshing a mug of chamomile in time with the music. Jerry shouted over the noise, "This is an unregulated event. I need backup." The mailman, yes, Carl was still technically on duty by now, raised his mug. "Consider me backup." At this point, I was no longer in control. I was just a man in pajamas, stumbling through his own front yard with mug number 17, watching his neighborhood reinvent itself as a tea carnival. Even Daisy had joined in the performance, howling along with the karaoke machine. Linda retreated indoors, muttering something about divorce by teabag. I thought, surely this will die down soon. Surely people have jobs, school, lives. But no, because at 7:30, the local news van rolled up. By 7:30, I thought things couldn't get bigger. I was wrong, because that's the exact moment a white van with a satellite dish on top squealed to a stop in front of my house. The side door slid open, and out spilled a local news crew like clowns from a circus car. Camera operator, sound guy, Anchor woman in a blazer, but also pajama pants. She clearly hadn't expected to be live this early. The anchor woman marched straight up to me, microphone in hand, a little too chipper for someone who'd been dragged from bed. "Sir," she said, "can you explain why there is a tea festival happening on your lawn at dawn?" I blinked at her through the steam rising from my 17th mug. "It started with chamomile." "Chamomile," she repeated solemnly, nodding as though she were covering an international summit. Gary materialized at my side, Hawaiian shirt flapping dramatically. "Tell them about Earl Grey." The reporter hesitated. "And who are you?" "Gary," he declared proudly. "Earl Grey ambassador. I speak for the bergamot." The sound guy nearly dropped his boom mic, laughing. Meanwhile, Carl, bless his postal heart, decided this was the moment to step forward. He held up his thermos like a prop. "And I represent Oolong, Experimental Division." Marjorie shuffled forward too, mug raised. "I'm Peppermint, Old Guard." The teens shouted, "We're bubble tea," and started waving their cups like glow sticks at a concert. Suddenly, my lawn looked less like a neighborhood gathering and more like the United Nations of beverages, each group loudly declaring its allegiance. The reporter's eyes sparkled. "This," she said to the camera, "is clearly the story of the morning. Viewers, what you're witnessing is the spontaneous birth of what locals are calling the T-Town Uprising." T-Town Uprising? I nearly spit out my chamomile. "Nobody's calling it that," I protested, but it was too late. The chyron on the bottom of the live feed, yes, she had us on live television, already read, "Breaking news, T-Town Uprising, stirs quiet suburb." The crowd erupted into cheers. Gary high-fived a teenager. Jerry saluted the camera. Daisy barked into the mic like she was being interviewed too. I stood there, pajama-clad, mug in hand, realizing my sleepy little routine had officially been broadcast to thousands of people eating breakfast in front of their TVs. Linda appeared at the window upstairs, arms crossed, eyebrows at maximum arch, the kind of look that says, "Henry, this will be discussed at length later." The reporter turned the mic back to me. "Sir, what do you say to claims that you've created a grassroots movement?" "A what?" "A movement," she said firmly. "Neighbors gathering, people bonding, all over tea. Some are calling you the Tea Mayor." "Mayor?" I squeaked. Gary whooped, "Long live Mayor Henry." And just like that, the chant began. "Mayor Henry! Mayor Henry!" Even Daisy barked in rhythm. I waved my hands desperately. No, I am not. This isn't. Look, I just wanted to go to bed." But the camera had already swung back to the crowd, capturing Jerry patrolling the hydration perimeter, Carl pouring experimental blends, Marjorie scolding Kyle about peppermint etiquette, and the teens attempting synchronized boba tricks. The reporter signed off with a smile. "Well, folks, you saw it here first. When life gives you insomnia, apparently you make a tea revolution. Back to you in the studio." The van pulled away. The crowd roared like they just won the Super Bowl. And me, I sank into a lawn chair, holding my mug like a white flag. Because if it was on TV now, it wasn't just my neighborhood's problem anymore. It was the world's. By 8:30 in the morning, I thought the whole thing would start tapering off. People have jobs, children to get on school buses, commutes, responsibilities, all those boring adult things that usually stop spontaneous all-night parties. Surely reality would reclaim everyone, but reality apparently hit the snooze button. Because once the morning news ran its T-Town Uprising segment, people I'd never seen before started arriving. not just curious neighbors, strangers. The first car was a minivan that squealed to a stop in front of my house. The side door slid open, and out tumbled a family of 4, still in their pajamas. The dad clutched travel mugs. The mom carried a box of blueberry muffins. The 2 kids were already chasing Daisy before I could ask what was happening. The dad beamed at me. "We saw you on TV. We wanted to be part of history." History. He said it like my front lawn was Gettysburg. Gary swooped in immediately. "Welcome, welcome, tea for all." He plucked mugs off Carl's sticky note labeled Command Center table and passed them out like souvenirs. Next came cyclists, 5 of them, pedaling in neon spandex, helmets glinting in the morning sun. They swerved onto the curb and unclipped their shoes with the solemnity of warriors returning from battle. "We rerouted our ride," one announced dramatically, "to hydrate with a movement." Jerry saluted. Hydration confirmed. The teens clapped politely, though one whispered, "They look like highlighters on bikes." And then 2 women in yoga pants appeared, lugging yoga mats under their arms. Without asking, they rolled them out on my driveway, struck tree pose, and announced it was tea and tree hour. One of them balanced a mug on her knee like she was auditioning for Cirque du Soleil. Meanwhile, Daisy was now wearing 2 napkins like capes, courtesy of the Muffin Kids, and sprinting in circles, occasionally stopping to bark at squirrels who dared wander too close to T-Town territory. I sat there in my lawn chair, bleary-eyed, clutching cup number 18, thinking, this was chamomile. This was supposed to make me sleep, not trend. And then I heard it. Bagpipes, actual bagpipes. A man in full Scottish regalia, kilt, sparran, the whole 9 yards, marched down the street blasting what I think was Scotland the Brave. Though honestly, it sounded like a balloon animal crying for help. He had a thermos strapped to his belt and between wails shouted, "Long live T-Town." The crowd erupted into cheers. The teens immediately filmed him for TikTok, adding captions like, "Be Bagpipe Tea Challenge." Linda cracked open the upstairs window, arms folded. "Henry," she called down, "why are there bagpipes?" I looked up helplessly. "I don't know, dear." Her sigh was so powerful it rattled the shutters. By 9 o'clock, my lawn looked like a county fair hosted by a very confused teapot. Someone had strung bunting made of empty tea boxes between my mailbox and Jerry's reflective vest. Marjorie had set up a peppermint tasting station, complete with a handwritten sign that read, "Respect Tradition." The teens countered with a bubble tea battle booth, daring people to try slurping tapioca pearls while doing jumping jacks. Pam from the corner house reappeared with a tray of scones, her second tray of the morning. "I just had these lying around," she said, as though scones multiply like rabbits in her kitchen. Larry, the squeaky bicycle man, was offering tea deliveries by pedaling up and down the street, mugs rattling in his bike basket. Half of them sloshed onto the pavement, but no one cared. "Tea is tea!" he shouted. The noise level doubled when someone wheeled out a karaoke machine. A neighbor in flannel pajamas grabbed the mic and launched into a heart-stoppingly off-key rendition of Moon River. The crowd swayed with their mugs raised. Daisy howled along, hitting more notes than the singer. Jerry scribbled furiously on his napkin reports. Moon River incident, muffin stampede, bagpipe arrival. He taped them to my mailbox like official law enforcement notices. Meanwhile, the barista had fully set up her espresso station on my porch. She was making lattes, cappuccinos, and something she called experimental hybrid drinks. A teenager tried a triple-shot Earl Grey latte and immediately began speaking in what sounded like Morse code. Another teen swore he could see colors that don't exist. Linda opened the window again. "Henry, do you know people are line dancing in the street?" I turned slowly. Sure enough, the cyclists, the yoga ladies, and Pam were stomping through a makeshift dance while holding their mugs aloft like torches. Someone had started fiddling on an old violin, trying to keep up with the bagpipes. "I see it," I admitted weakly. "You're cleaning this up," she said firmly, and the window slammed shut again. At 9:15, strangers started arriving with signs. "Honk for tea," one read. "Join the infusion," said another. Drivers passing by actually honked, and the crowd cheered every time like it was a fireworks show. And then, a food truck rolled up. It wasn't even subtle. A huge silver truck with "Greg's Creeps" painted on the side screeched to a halt, music blasting. Greg himself leaned out the window, slapped a cardboard sign over the logo, and shouted, "Welcome to T-Town Eats!" The crowd went wild. Crepes started flying out the window. Nutella, strawberry, savory cheese. And people grabbed them like lifeboats. Daisy stole one and buried it in the neighbor's flower bed. I tried one last desperate attempt at order. I stood again, mug raised high, voice trembling but determined. "Everyone, listen! This has gone far enough. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted chamomile before bed." The crowd fell silent. I actually thought, for one shimmering second, that maybe they'd disperse, realize this was insane, and go home. Then Gary shouted, "The mayor speaks!" And suddenly the chant rose again. "Mayor Henry! Mayor Henry!" Someone draped a garland of tea bags around my neck like a ceremonial sash. A stranger shoved a muffin into my hand. Daisy barked like she was swearing me into office. I slumped back into my chair. Mayor against my will. Chamomile turned dictatorship. At 9:30, I realized the truth. This wasn't winding down. This wasn't even peaking. It was gaining momentum. And the worst part? I saw another news van turning onto the street. By 10 o'clock, my block was unrecognizable. Cars lined both sides of the street. Strangers strolled in with travel mugs, yoga mats, and folding chairs like they were attending a county fair. Balloons appeared. No one admitted to bringing them. But suddenly, 3 were tied to my mailbox. And then came the second news van. This one wasn't local. The logo on the side read, "National Morning Now." The kind of show with anchors who usually stand in pumpkin patches in October and say, "It's sweater weather." A reporter in a perfectly pressed suit bounded out, beaming. He didn't even look tired. He had the manic energy of someone fueled entirely by TV adrenaline and probably 17 espressos. "America wants to meet the tea mayor," he announced, marching straight up to me. "I am not the tea mayor," I said weakly, clutching mug number 19. But it was useless. Gary shouted, "All hail," and the crowd erupted again. "Mayor Henry, Mayor Henry!" The national reporter grinned. "We're going live in 60 seconds. Any words for the country?" I blinked. "Go to bed?" He laughed like I'd told the funniest joke in history. "Oh, he's charming. He's authentic. He's sleepless." Before I could protest, a camera was in my face, lights glaring, microphone shoved under my nose. "Ladies and gentlemen," the reporter boomed, "we are here at the spontaneous movement sweeping suburbia, the T-Town Uprising, and here is its reluctant leader, the so-called tea mayor, Henry." Cheers exploded. Daisy barked. Someone banged on a saucepan like it was a drum. Linda appeared at the window again, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly I was afraid they'd vanish. She mouthed the words, "We will talk." Meanwhile, Jerry had escalated his hydration patrol. He was now wearing 2 reflective vests, no one knows where the second came from, directing cars like he was running a festival parking lot. Drivers obeyed. Of course they did. Jerry had the aura of a man who lives for whistle authority. Carl had taken to stamping people's hands with tea bags to track entry. It left damp floral-shaped blotches. People loved it. "It's artisanal," one woman whispered. Marjorie, sensing the moment, marched up to the camera. "Peppermint forever," she declared, mug raised like a revolutionary flag. The teens countered, shoving bubble tea into the lens. "Boba is the future," the reporter ate it up. "This is democracy in action, folks. A true grassroots movement," I muttered. "It's grass-stained, all right," as I watched Daisy dig up Greg's crepe stand to bury her 3rd stolen pastry. By 10:30, the street was a gridlock. Curious onlookers parked illegally just to grab mugs of tea and selfies with the mayor. I tried to hide behind the azaleas, but people kept pulling me out for photos. Somewhere in the chaos, a marching band appeared. Full brass section, uniforms and all. When asked why, they said, "We had a cancellation at the mall." The noise was deafening. Bagpipes, trumpets, karaoke, clinking mugs, and Gary narrating over it all like a deranged historian. And then came the city officials. A small convoy of white cars with municipal logos pulled up. Out stepped a harried-looking woman with a clipboard, flanked by 2 men in polo shirts. She introduced herself as Assistant Deputy something or other for Community Affairs. Her eyes swept over the crowd, the banners, the food truck, the marching band. "What," she asked slowly, "is happening here?" Gary proudly gestured. "The T-Town Uprising," Carl saluted. "Postal Service representation present," Jerry barked into his whistle. "Perimeter secure." Marjorie thrust peppermint under her nose. "For the people." The official blinked. "Do you all have a permit?" Silence. Every mug froze midair. Even Daisy stopped chewing her crepe wrapper. I swallowed. It started with chamomile." The official rubbed her temples. "That is not a permit." The crowd murmured nervously. But before panic could spread, Greg the crepe guy hollered, "First crepe free with every permit application," and handed her a Nutella special. She sighed, took a bite, and muttered, "Fine. Temporary community event status, but this ends by noon." Cheers erupted. People hugged. A man in pajamas wept tears of joy into his mug. I just sat back down, exhausted, wondering if I could build a bed under the table and finally collapse. But then the national reporter announced, "And up next, we've heard rumors of T-Town expanding statewide." Statewide. I nearly fainted into my chamomile. By 11 o'clock, I was a shell of a man, pajamas rumpled, hair sticking out like an electrocuted hedgehog, mug number 20 wobbling in my trembling hand. I had become less Henry the human and more Henry the herbal tea bag steeped too long. The street was chaos. The marching band blared. Bagpipes squealed. Teenagers filmed TikToks in synchronized sips. Cyclists performed tea-balancing stunts on their bikes. Jerry had built a hydration checkpoint using traffic cones. Carl was stamping newcomers with soggy tea bags like they were passports. Marjorie had gathered a following of peppermint purists who sat cross-legged chanting, "Cool and calm, cool and calm." And me? I wanted a nap, a pillow, a bed, a wormhole back to the moment before I brewed that first chamomile. Then the national reporter shouted, Breaking update. Officials are discussing whether T-Town could become a permanent event. The crowd went wild. Someone threw confetti made of shredded tea boxes. Daisy chased it, sneezed, and promptly stole another crepe. I stood, mug raised high, voice shaking with desperation. No, no more. I am not the tea mayor. I'm just a tired man who wanted to go to bed. Silence fell. Even the bagpipes stopped mid-squeak. All eyes turned to me. Hundreds of them, neighbors, strangers, cyclists, yoga mat warriors, peppermint purists, boba revolutionaries. I took a deep breath. Friends, neighbors, random people who clearly don't even live here. This isn't sustainable. Look at us, we're delirious. We're arguing about peppermint like it's politics. We're chanting at dogs. We've all had way too much tea. We need to stop. We need to, dare I say it, sleep. Gasps, murmurs. Someone dropped a mug. Gary frowned. But Henry, what about the movement? I sighed. Movements are fine. But sometimes the bravest thing you can do is go home, brush your teeth, and take a nap. Marjorie lowered her peppermint like a white flag. Carl slumped in his chair, muttering, "Maybe I'm tired." Even Jerry's whistle went limp. And then Linda appeared at the door, bathrobe, arms crossed, but this time smiling, just barely. "You heard the man," she said. "Party's over. Everyone out?" Like children dismissed from recess, the crowd groaned but obeyed. Slowly, the street cleared. The marching band packed up. The crepe truck rumbled away. The teens slurped their last boba pearls and shuffled off. Jerry saluted me one final time, and at long last, quiet returned. I staggered inside, dropped into bed, and finally, closed my eyes. The last thing I heard before drifting off was Linda's voice, soft but amused. Only you could turn chamomile into a natural disaster. And that, my friends, was the night my bedtime routine got stuck on the tea stage and nearly took the whole neighborhood with it. If you enjoyed this cozy chaos, don't forget to subscribe for more. Bedtime Stories. May your tea be warm, your dogs be mischievous, and your chamomile lead only to sleep, not a suburban uprising. Good night from Mayor Henry.